Milton and Rose say that parents should be able to direct their tax money to any school of their choice, public or private, secular or religious. Today, some states and cities are experimenting. Here in Milwaukee, the oldest and largest program in the country is limited to only 15,000 poor students. And the school choice voucher is worth little more than half of what would be spent on a child in a public school. Messmer High School and its elementary school are private inner-city Catholic schools, certainly no bastions of privilege. Students come from some of the poorest, roughest neighborhoods in the city. Tiara Gibson recently transferred to Messmer.
I wouldn't want to be anywhere else because the atmosphere here is great. The school I went to for my first 2 years of high school was a public school, and it was supposed to be a college-bound school, but you had metal detectors to walk through to get to class certain times of the year. Students yelling, screaming, cursing, fighting. It was just horrible.
The state of Wisconsin requires that voucher schools take every child who applies, regardless of their academic record. Still, at Messmer, nearly 90% go on to college. Jeff Monday is the high school principal.
It is a matter of justice that a parent is able to use a voucher, which is power. Money is power.
Harvard professor Caroline Hawksby researches voucher programs across the country, including students in the Milwaukee program.
They appear to be doing better in the voucher schools after about 3 to 4 years. We can see statistically significant improvements in their achievement in math and reading.
Everybody.
So they're doing a little bit better, spending about half of the money.
Everybody on page 8?
The voucher program also impacts the Milwaukee public schools.
There were just staggering changes in a couple of years. There are schools in Milwaukee that stood to lose virtually 100% of their students if they didn't do something to ensure that their students didn't leave with the voucher. We saw those schools improve their student achievement more in the first 2 years after the voucher program expanded than they had in the previous 30, 35 years.
I don't assume that private schools are better than public schools. I assume that competition is a way in which both public and private schools can be required to satisfy their customers.
Let's start with number 5 up there.
In which the bad private schools will fail and the bad public schools will fail. So the fundamental assumption is simply that competition is better than monopoly.
Milton and Rose have created the Friedman Foundation to continue the fight for school choice. By the 1960s, Milton's writings and lectures are gaining international attention. Their home movies recall their foreign travel. A trip to India, where Milton had advised the government 6 years earlier, and trips throughout Europe, Asia, and the Middle East.
The worst of Israel's problems is inflation. One of the experts the new government has turned to for advice is Professor Milton Friedman.
Milton's ideas about economics and how to fight inflation are always the topic of conversation.
I suspect that you could not find an economist in Israel, whatever his political coloration, who would not agree with most of what I've said. The problem is a political problem of how do you put it into effect.
Although Milton had advised government leaders around the world, he had until now never participated in politics at home.
The 1964 presidential campaign is officially launched.
President Lyndon Johnson is running for re-election after the assassination of John Kennedy.
Make no mistake, there is no such thing as a conventional nuclear weapon.
His challenger is Senator Barry Goldwater.
When I say that America must take a firm line with communist leaders until their evil system ceases to threaten the world.
Goldwater and Milton share similar ideas about limiting government and deregulating industries. Milton becomes an economic advisor to the Goldwater campaign.
During that year, he was very active, not only in the campaign, but in speaking throughout New York City and being considered this crazy economist who was actually supporting Barry Goldwater. There were very few intellectuals who were supporting Barry Goldwater at that time.
President Johnson successfully portrays Goldwater as a radical, and Goldwater loses in one of the biggest landslides in American history. Richard Parker.
Goldwater's defeat was so disastrous, so overwhelming, that Galbraith thought that Friedman's ideas, along with Goldwater's candidacies, had pretty much finished the far right off in American politics.
It looked like a low point for these ideas, and I think most people thought that at the time.
But within 4 years, Friedman's ideas would once again be tested on the national political scene. By the mid-1960s, America is becoming increasingly embroiled in the conflict in Southeast Asia. As more and more Americans die in Vietnam, the public debate intensifies.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president. Thank you.
Richard Nixon emerges as the Republican candidate. Milton is invited to serve as an advisor to Nixon. During these years, Milton and others succeed with a dramatic and far-reaching policy initiative.
The use of compulsion is repugnant to our society except in cases of dire emergency.
Milton had been writing and lecturing about the benefits of ending the draft and creating an all-volunteer military.
It is long past time that we return to our basic heritage, got rid of the compulsion in our military service, and return to a voluntary system.
Now the unpopular Vietnam War has driven the issue from the lecture halls to the streets.
I talked to quite a number of SDS groups, and I always got along very well with them because it was clear that our objectives were the same. And what we were talking about was not objectives, but how you achieve those objectives.
As the draft becomes one of the hottest issues of the day, President Nixon creates a commission to consider change. He appoints Milton Friedman and Alan Greenspan.
We had a couple of generals on that commission who obviously were brought up with the draft, believed it was essential. And a general who came before us in testimony.
And so I spoke up and said, General Westmoreland, would you rather command a slave force? And he said, I don't like to hear my drafted soldiers referred to as slaves. And I said, I don't like to hear my patriotic volunteers referred to as mercenaries.
Milton sat there and took his arguments apart piece by piece, never raised his voice.
In any event, General Westmoreland, you are a mercenary general, and I am a mercenary professor. We are served by a mercenary lawyer. We are served by a mercenary doctor.
The general got redder and redder, and at the end of this little set of dissections, the mercenary argument was thoroughly demolished.
And that was the end of the discussion.
Martin Anderson was one of Nixon's official advisors.
I wrote a policy paper recommending getting rid of the draft, and I borrowed liberally from Milton's paper. And Nixon agreed, switched his policy from a universal military service. He advocated it, drove it in the campaign, and in 1971, we eliminated the draft.
Today, Milton still downplays his personal role in ending the draft.
Many people were writing in favor of a volunteer army. It was not my idea in any way, shape, form, or manner.
Milton is rarely wrong about anything. He's wrong about that.
The ramifications have been enormous. Nobody has gone back and said, no, this crazy idea that Milton had way back in the 60s, what were the ramifications? I tell you, we now have the most powerful force in the world.
And so the American military, long guaranteed a steady supply of recruits from the draft, had suddenly been forced into the marketplace.